Welcome back. It's time for the second part of tonight's debate devoted to the Ukrainian ceasefire and whether or not it is, in fact, still alive. Tonight, fighting continues in the key town of Debaltseve, leaving that ceasefire which came into effect Saturday night looking increasingly shaky, particularly after the deadline for the withdrawal of heavy weaponry from the front line came and went. Is the deal dead? That's what we're considering tonight with my guest, Michel Grabart, who's a member of the Coordination Council of the Russian Forum here in France. Also with me is Anna Garmash, who's a Euromaidan activist and president of the Ukraine Action Association. Here on the set, equally, Julian Nundy, who's an independent journalist and knows the region well. And, of course, Julien Théron, who is an analyst in geopolitics, the geopolitics of conflicts, and he teaches at the University of Versailles. We're also joined down the line from Kiev by the editor for the Kiev Post, Max Tucker. I wanted to ask you, you've extensively been covering the events in eastern Ukraine over the last few months. You have correspondents dotted throughout the region. We were talking earlier about the involvement of regular Russian troops. What evidence of that have you seen?
Well, just yesterday, actually, there was a pro-Russian journalist who accidentally filmed a whole series of lined up Russian T-72B3 tanks. Those are only made in Russia. The separatists couldn't possibly have captured them from the Ukrainian government forces. And they're also extremely complicated, sophisticated equipment. And we've also seen that the US has released satellite images of very well-organized Russian artillery in the region. We've seen very sophisticated anti-aircraft equipment, which can only be used by very trained professionals, which separatists simply wouldn't have had time to do that training in the months that they've had.
Given, Julien Théron, that there is very little doubt of Russian support for what's been happening in eastern Ukraine now a year after the crisis began. Much, of course, of what happens in eastern Ukraine depends not at all on what Angela Merkel or François Hollande may or may not want, but entirely on what Vladimir Putin decides, and it seems that he hasn't decided in favor of peace for now.
Well, it was still a very proud move from the Europeans, because they agreed, for instance, not to talk about Crimea, which was completely illegally annexed. So they were kind of going there with very good intentions for peace in Ukraine. But of course, you can't talk with the people who fight, actually. It was said earlier that Mr. Poroshenko should actually talk to the rebels, but they should stop firing first. You can't talk to somebody who's firing at you. And the other point is that it was said as well that Mr. Putin, is very hard for him to force the rebels to stop. Well, for instance, it's very easy to stop supplying the rebels and the Russian forces, and to call back people like Igor Strelkov, who is a member of the Russian intelligence over there. So, I mean, there's a direct implication of Russia over there. So it's not that hard. It's just a question of political decision.
Michel Grabart, if that's true, then the real problem is that Vladimir Putin has not decided to allow this to end.
I think he wants to solve the problem of Debaltseve, and afterwards to push to put pressure on Mr. Poroshenko in order him to meet the so-called separatists or rebels. And of course he is controlling partly the situation. The Russians cannot say that officially, that's for sure, but it's obvious. But what is important is what could have happened, and we could have had a real war in Mariupol, in Odessa, in Kharkiv, and I'm very happy that it didn't happen. So now people are just focused on Debaltseve. That's important, for sure. There are people, there are troops, soldiers dying there. But in comparison with what could happen, we can be very happy that Mr. Poroshenko had to. For him, he lost the face. For him, it's very difficult. It means negotiations, for sure. But he lost. But from my point of view, it's good for peace in Europe.
That is the point, Julian Nundy, is that even as this deal was signed in Minsk last week, it was the weakness of the Ukrainians that we were reminded of. It seemed to include, of course, many of the problems from the Ukrainian point of view, the acceptance that there is a de facto separatist zone in Ukraine, but actually also then forced Kiev to pay for the rebel area. So it went even further than Minsk once one had against the interests of Kiev.
Yes, indeed. Kiev did not come out of that one winning at all. But I mean, I think everyone would win if the killing were to stop, and if the fighting were to stop, then there would be more chances. We're talking about Poroshenko needing to talk to the rebels. There was actually a meeting in Minsk a couple of weeks before where the rebel leaders went. Yeah. And their attitude was extremely difficult. It was under OSCE auspices, and they were virtually not talking.
And the problem, of course, and this is the reason, no doubt, those talks weren't terribly productive, or the attitude was not the right one. The point is that as long as the separatists are winning on the ground, they have no interest at all in stopping fighting.
Seems like that, indeed, that they want to take as much ground as they can, and it's been looking like that for a while, and it still looks like that. Nothing has changed. The ceasefire hasn't changed anything, that's for sure.
So if Debaltseve, Max, if you're still joining us from Kiev, falls, and we're reminded once again of the strength of the separatists on the ground, is Kiev going to be calling for Washington to come through on what it had suggested it might be thinking about, which is arming Ukrainian regular forces?
Well, Ukraine is already desperately calling on Washington and its allies in Europe to arm Ukrainian forces and help them fend off what's now quite clearly not just a separatist attack, but an assault by Russian armed forces. It's interesting that you talked about Minsk 1 there. I mean, we were talking then about Donetsk Airport and who Donetsk Airport belonged to, and the theory was that after the fighting for Donetsk Airport, perhaps the issue would be solved. But now we're talking about Debaltseve. It's the second town. It's a huge rebel offensive that has got them this far. So really, the separatists show absolutely no sign of being really interested in peace or talking. And as long as they're making territorial gains, they'll probably continue with that attitude.
Yes, but there is a slight difference that during the fight for Donetsk Airport there was no agreement, no frame. Now we have a frame, and things are written down, so we know what the process can be, and that makes a very substantial difference from my point of view.
Is that could it make a difference, Max? Do you think that the fact that there's an agreement now behind Debaltseve, could that help mean that once the guns have fallen silent around the town, should it fall entirely to the separatists, then perhaps the rest of the agreement can be pushed through?
I think there was a very clear agreement on Minsk 1 that both sides should stop shooting. And that agreement was not only not followed, but the separatists launched an offensive all along the entire Ukrainian line. I mean, clearly the separatists have no interest in a ceasefire. They just want to grab as much territory as they can.
Julien Théron, Washington had been quite clear. It was considering coming on, looking at this idea very seriously. A number of key people seem to have been convinced over the course of the last few weeks that it was now time to consider providing lethal aid to Ukraine. That talk was stopped with the flurry of diplomatic activity kicked off by Angela Merkel and François Hollande last week that led to Minsk II. But Washington remained very clear. If Minsk II failed, that talk will come back. Is it now time for the United States to help Ukraine from a material point of view to gain the upper hand on the ground?
Well, it's not my role to get or advise the political decision, but what is very important to see that we are facing a very difference of political culture between Russia and the West. What we try to build in Europe is a politics of cooperation. So we try to negotiate, talk and establish agreements. And if we can't do that, it means that there's just one thing remaining, which it means containment, actually. So, and what means very precisely cooperation, it means when we do have an agreement, the agreement is implemented. And today in Debaltseve, it's not the case. So, and it's the second round, and like I said, we have been very willful, the French and German government, going there and not speaking, for instance, about Crimea. It was a very nice move toward Mr. Putin. But if we do fail,
it was a reminder of the West's weakness on this, was it not?
It was good intentions, I guess. And it was to save, I agree with that, it was to save peace in Europe. So it was good intentions. Absolutely. But the point is that if we just have a glance on the situation. The rebels and the Russian forces over there just go ahead. So if we can't talk, if we can't apply the agreements, well then we have to contain Russia again, like we did, like with the USSR. I mean,
through the supply of weapons to Ukraine.
well, it is asked. There was elections. Russia backed the rebels because saying that otherwise the new Kiev, like so-called neo-Nazi regime, will just organize a massive repression of the Russian speakers, which absolutely did not happen. And then, I mean, like there was some free elections under the survey of the OSCE, like you were part of. And so if it's not like that, it's not happening like that. So if there's no other solution, well, maybe yes.
I don't agree, because 600,000 people fled to Russia, and 900,000 fled to other towns and places in Ukraine. So
there's no one single aggression of Russian speaking in Ukraine.
But there were casualties. There are people, children, dead because of the fights, and because of the bad ceasefire, and a not very clear situation when people came down and were shot because they were not at the right place at the right moment. So the situation was not clear. Now the situation it's much clearer. And
so you mean that the Poroshenko is kind of the head of a neo-Nazi regime?
No. But he was Maidan. I had students and very nice people on the Maidan, and I understand that they prefer to live like as in Poland. And I understand this idea of European idea of young Ukrainian students, and for sure, Mr. Yanukovych was not a good president. So there is no debate about that. But what we can say that also Mr. Poroshenko and other people, Kolomoisky and these kind of people, used also neo-fascist groups to win on the Maidan, and so you know that, everybody knows that. But I wanted to just to answer maybe the question you raised. So the bad idea would be to invite the United States to come back in the debate, and to put down the idea of Crimea back on the table, to rearm Ukraine, because it's not a way to solve the situation. What is important is to solve. Of course, you win. Of course, you can lose, but we are moving to a solution.
That's what France and Germany tried to do with Minsk.
I agree,
too.
Absolutely. And so, and Mr. Poroshenko, I think, has to understand that, and Putin too, because it's bad. It's very bad for Russia. The sanctions. The situation is bad for Russia. It's bad for Europe. It's bad for Ukraine. Ukraine could have ceased to exist. So it's better to have such a Ukraine with the border, maybe with more autonomous parts of Ukraine on the eastern part, but you have still a country, and I think Poroshenko understood that he could have lost very much.
Julian Lundy, it's important here that Poroshenko and Washington are not tempted to take on force by force, but rather keep the possibility of talking even after Debaltseve.
I think you'll find on the Western side there's a great hesitation about sending arms of any description, whether they're purely defensive or not, because anything could be seen as a provocative gesture. So there's this problem between a rock and a hard place here. Do you arm them or don't you? And if you do, what are the consequences? And if you don't, what are the consequences? And this seems to be a debate with no answer. But I think we must give Mr. Poroshenko more credit for understanding what's going on than is being given here. And we should also remember there's always talk about neo-Nazis and the far right and so on. The far right in last spring's presidential elections got less than 2% in the vote, which is a good deal less than you get in France.
But actually,
just one point. The elections is one thing, but to even for a revolution, there must be not just very nice students, but also people who know how to fight. And in Odessa, for instance, what happened in Odessa was
on May the 2nd, yes, the fire.
Was terrible.
Yes.
And the ultra right were involved in that.
I'd like to put it to Anna Gamache. You were, of course, on Maidan. You were part of the revolution. But it is a reminder, is it not, that there are two very different views in Ukraine about what happened at the time of the Ukrainian revolution. And there are those in eastern Ukraine who had legitimate fears about what it would mean to them, and who welcomed what the separatists were doing.
There are some people who were thinking that, of course, that is undeniable. However, there is a certain media image that was projected that was not necessarily true. Projected, by the way, by the Russian media in the first place, to begin with. Because having been on the Maidan, there were obviously, as in any sort of revolution, some far-right forces, but they are extremely minor. They were a bit more visible, obviously, because they were a bit more violent, but they were extremely... There was a very thin minority of those people. However, when you asked those living in the East, are you afraid of those? Are you afraid of those people, of those so-called Bandera fighters or something like this? They say, yes, I am. This is what I'm afraid of. Have you seen any so far? No, none of them. Well, you're afraid of a ghost in the end.
On that question of perceptions, though, Julian Nundy, and going back to the question of the possible American arming of Ukrainian forces, were Minsk II to fail, were Washington to decide to arm Kiev, would that not simply reinforce Vladimir Putin's clear perception that Eastern Ukraine and through Eastern Ukraine Russian interests are under threat from Washington, the EU, NATO? This is what has been at the heart of his own decision to support the separatists.
Yeah, definitely. But you could have observed that Ukrainian forces are not accused to be in Russia today. So the debate is a little bit tricked. But he's a very clever man. And when we have to ask the question and to answer to that, we are already in his game, actually. Because, of course, if we don't do anything, well, Ukraine can be eaten, just like Debaltseve today. Or if we do something like giving weapons to Ukraine, it's just like what you said, and what you said as well. Then, yes, it will be seen as a provocation for Moscow. But in both ways, we're losing. So we definitely have to counter and to turn around this trouble and to find a peaceful solution. That would be the best.
One of the extraordinary things you mentioned earlier, the difficulty for Vladimir Putin, the sanctions, the state of the Russian economy, and so on. Nothing seems to have dented his popularity at home, on the contrary, and he seems in this extraordinary position of force when it comes to Ukraine. Nothing anyone can do opposite seems to stop him making the advances or having the upper hand.
So because he's controlling the medias, and he has a very good tool, and it's the Russian nationalism and the revival of the Second World War. And the idea of Bandera, the fascists, and he of course, it's clever, but it's working. And of course, in the eastern part of Ukraine, people are watching television, Russian television, and there is a propaganda saying that it's very close to what happened during the Second World War, or even during the Napoleon War, when the West was marching on Russia. So, but and that's a propaganda, and that works when the situation in Russia is complicated, but of course he understands that he wants to solve the situation in Russia, and he cannot do that without the West. Russia needs Western technology in energy, in electronics, and so for Russia the situation is very bad. So he doesn't want to control, to eat Ukraine. That's a myth, or I don't know. But he wants to have a good situation in his country, because he lost in terms of confidence very much, and he took Crimea, but in terms of confidence, he lost the confidence of the West, and that's very important.
But he's also, has he not, Julian Nundy, proved to the West his extraordinary strength, which will redefine the relationship between Moscow and the rest of the world in a number of different geopolitical arenas over the coming years.
Well, I think the relationship is redefined, obviously, and it's going to take some years to return to a state of trust between the two sides. The problem seems to be, from my viewpoint, is that things have been going step by step, that it's difficult to see whether there is a plan, a policy over several years, or whether this has just been a piece-by-piece action. And it looks very much like that. But during all these months, there's been no amount of pressure the West has brought to bear has really had any effect, and that is pretty worrying.
From your point of view, Anna, and those who took part in the revolution, we're looking, and the best case scenario is that Minsk II holds. The de facto separation of Ukraine into two separate parts, with Moscow keeping a certain amount of influence over a substantial part of the country. Is the revolution something now that its activists have come to regret?
Not at all, actually, because in the first place, nobody could have ever imagined that it would end up like this. In the very beginning of the Maidan demonstrations, if somebody had told me that an open war would be happening in Ukraine, I'd never ever believed this. And it was a genuine effort to bring some state of law, to eliminate corruption, to bring some human rights into Ukraine. So we're never going to regret this, because there are still efforts going on from the civil society to improve the state of the government. Obviously, we call this revolution. However, a revolution is something that sort of ended in the end. This movement hasn't ended so far. Obviously, there has been a sort of regime change. Another president was elected. But the point is not in electing just a different president and hoping that everything's going to be fine from now on. The point was in trying to change the system as far as we could go. And obviously, this doesn't happen from one day to another. Nobody is naive enough to think so. So there's still a lot of efforts to try to lobby the government into passing laws. There is a lot of effort for help for the army, obviously, also for the refugees. There's a lot of things that are going on within the civil society to improve the state. It's still going on, obviously.
But while there's a war going on, all the efforts at reform, getting rid of corruption, are slowed down considerably, because the priority is obviously going to be the security situation.
And this
creates an internal domestic danger.
Which was, they say, part of Vladimir Putin's calculation in all this.
The problem is that the money that the Ukraine will get from Europe or from the West must be totally or partly used by the building of an army, and that's very bad. Instead of doing reforms or reforming economics and so on, Poroshenko could have built an army, so. I think we have to go back to the context. The context is, when I talk to Ukrainian people, they say, let us decide what we want for us. It's not the point of... We are Ukraine, we are a state, we can do what we want. But my answer is very clear, that your main neighbor is Russia, and if you become a part of NATO, it's for Russia it's very dangerous. You cannot make such decisions alone.
I'd like to put to you, Julien Théron, the words of Petro Poroshenko within the last few minutes. He's described the rebel actions in Debaltseve as a cynical attack on the peace deal. He's been speaking to Angela Merkel, and he's appealing to the United Nations to prevent further violations, and he says the full-scale military operations in the heart of Europe. He's demanded a tough response from the West against Russia over the broken truce. The point is, he's very unlikely to get it.
Well, like you said, he was appearing as feeble in Minsk. He accepted to be dishonored over there. But if it doesn't work, he doesn't have many tools. It's rather the UN or NATO, but he can't do much about it. And clearly, he wanted to establish a full reform program for the country. But he can't do that in this situation, you're right. And it's a main failure for Ukraine, and it's a way for Russia to keep Ukraine a little bit under control. And it's a very bad situation in the end.
Of course,
for both.
The trouble, Julian, and is the UN Security Council has by definition been divided on this issue and remarkably inefficient. The only tough response Mr. Poroshenko could hope for would come from Washington, and it would come in the form of supplying weapons, and it's something that divides the United States from its European allies.
Yes, and it's also, you may have noticed that President Obama has not shown any great enthusiasm for this idea. This has been coming from a lot of some hawks in Congress and so on. So I think it's not a given that the United States is prepared to give better arms to Ukraine.
Well, meanwhile, the fighting continues in Debaltseve this evening with that ceasefire, of course, in the balance will continue to follow events there and any further developments over the course of the evening. Thank you very much to all my guests for having been with us this evening. Thank you also to Max, who's joined us from Kiev with the latest from the ground in eastern Ukraine. That brings us to the end of tonight's debate. We'll be back again for another debate at the same time tomorrow. Do join us then.